Iron Curtain is a game of political influence for 2 players. It is a micro game. Really, as you will see, it is very minimalistic. It is set during the Cold War, and it somehow attempts to portray the main dynamics of the Cold War, but in a very digestible, very minimalistic form. When you do not have time or don't have the stamina to play to at a struggle, this is a much smaller alternative. Now, as I said, very small. This is the game. Well, they also have the rulebook, which is also pretty short, but very small game. You have cubes that represent influence. Red cubes are used by the Soviet player, blue cubes by the American player. We have an influence track. You place that token there in the middle of the track at the beginning of the game. When a player scores points, that player moves the marker by that number of spaces towards their home space, and if the marker reaches one of the home spaces, that player wins the game. Otherwise, at the end of the game, the player whose side the token is wins the game. And then we have a starter card here. You place it on the table at the beginning of the game, and then we have the deck of cards. If deck is even the word. It is a deck in that you shuffle it and you assign cards, you draw cards, but it is so small. The game is played in 2 rounds. The first round, each player receives 5 cards. And of those cards, only 4 will be played, 1 will be set aside by the players for final scoring. Players then play those 4 cards, and then players receive 4 more cards each for the second round, and at the end of the second round, well, you determine who the winner is. So basically you get to set aside a card and play 8 cards and do what the cards say. So incredibly minimalistic in nature. The cards they indicate a country, they indicate a region, and here you have an indication of how many countries are in that region. For example, there are 3 countries, and therefore 3 cards in Asia, 4 in Africa, 2 in the Middle East. And then we have Europe with 6. The bonus that you see on top is scored by the player that controls the majority of cards in that region when the region is scored, but we'll talk about that later. Here we have the alliance. The banner indicates who can use the action that is described here, and then you have a number of cubes so that you can command. The command means to place cubes on the board or in the play area, following the command action and the restriction of the command action, which is pretty much you already need to have cubes adjacent to where you're putting them in order to command new cubes on a card. At the beginning of the game, there is a red cube and a blue cube on the starter card, and this is how it works. When it is your turn, you choose a card from your hand and you play it. If there already are cards of that region in the play area, you must place the new one adjacent to one of them. At the beginning of the game, only Europe is there, so if there aren't cards at all of that region yet, or those cards have been closed off by other cards, basically if you cannot put it adjacent to cards of the same region, then you can put it wherever you like. So, as yeah, there you go. South America, and then later another player will play this card, and then later another player wants to play another South American card, then the card can be placed here because now we have a South American card and the new one needs to be adjacent to it. And maybe then this other player will do this. Adjacent only counts orthogonally, not diagonally. Now, so during your turn, you take a card, you place a card. Then if that is the last card in the region that you're playing, you score the region, but we'll talk about that later. So if I play the 4th African card or the 2nd, look at that, 2nd South American card, we get to score it, to score the entire region, but we'll talk about that later. So you play a card, possibly you score, and then there is the main phase of the turn. The player who controls the banner on the card that was just played may choose to activate that action, even if that is not the active player. I'm the Soviet player, I play this card, now the American player can choose to use that action. So sometimes use the actions out of turn, which is interesting. Many actions are conditional. Do this if, and of course there is a big element of strategy here in trying to play cards in an order so that the opponent that could activate the action does not get to do so because the conditions do not apply. And if you're the player, of course, again, you can activate your action. Finally, you get to command a number of cubes. So say here I get 3 cubes. Suppose that I am the Soviet player. And again, you need to place cubes adjacent to areas that you control or in areas that you already control. I could place these 2 there and these 2 here. Then suppose the American player does this, then the Soviet player decides to activate that action, and the American player gets 3 cubes, and the American player decides to invest a lot in Zaire. Now, if the opponent in an area has 2 cubes more than the other player, then that player controls the region, which means to add cubes to that region, the opponent will need to pay a cost of 2 for 1. So if I have a card that lets me say command 4 cubes into a card and I want to put them there, then it takes, we are 3 to 0, so I waste 1, I discard it, and I play another one. The opponent is still ahead by 2, and then I discard another one and I place another one. So being ahead by at least 2 makes it very expensive for the other player to reverse the situation. So after a while, the situation on the board may look a little bit like this. I call it board, maybe play area would be more appropriate, but it kind of feels like a board, really. And there's also, speaking of special actions, again, it may be actions that influence the score. You simply gain ideology points, that is, you pull the marker towards your home base. It could be that you infiltrate cubes, in which case it simply means that you can place cubes in the play area without having to worry about your pieces being adjacent. So this is the general idea. Play a card, possibly score. The player that controls that banner may activate the action, and then the active player gets to place cubes. Scoring, yes, finally, we said regional scoring. When you have a region that has been played entirely, it's entirely on the table, then you get to score it. You look at each card, and for each card, the player with majority scores 1 point. Here the Soviets get 1 point because they have a majority 2 to 1, and here the same. Then you look at the region, and the player that controls the most cards in that region gets that bonus, in which case would be +1 that the Soviet player gets because the Soviet player controls 2 out of 2. Europe has a bonus of +3, so that's a pretty valuable, pretty important area. Also 6 cards, so it won't score for a while. Very interesting, very interesting. Possibilities as different areas of the world work differently. They're triggered in different ways. They give you different possibilities and amounts of points. So this is the general idea. You continue like this until the end of the game. Then when all cards have been played, you reveal the 2 cards that have been set aside. It doesn't matter who set them aside. It only matters that they are there. So you reveal them, and you look at the number of cubes that are there and who controls those cubes. You subtract the cubes of the player with fewer cubes from the number of players with the most cubes, and that is the number of points that the player with majority gets to score. It's an incredibly complicated way of saying 2 cubes for the Soviets, 1 for the Americans, 2 minus 1 is 1, the Soviets get 1 point. I know, right? Sometimes you have to be verbose to explain simple things. The difference between the cubes for the 2 sides is the number of points that a player with majority gets to score. Then you score, again, every region, you score again, reach region in the play area one last time. And you get to score them in a specific order: Europe first, Middle East, Asia, Africa, South America, and Central America. And at the point, you see who the winner is. I like Iron Curtain. It's pretty impressive. It's really impressive what you can do with some 19, 20 cards and a bunch of cubes when you connect the effects and you program the interactions and the options well. And speaking of options, this is really a game that gives you quite a bit to do and to think about, especially, again, when you consider how small and physically limited the game is, because you had to take into account, of course, well, what you have in your hand, and that's obvious, but the schedule in which you are gonna give the opponent the possibility to activate certain things. My opponent is almost scoring that thing. I really don't want him to get this special action now that would allow him to score. Then I need to do something else. Maybe I can tweak and manipulate things in such a way that it cannot trigger that effect. Oh my gosh, now the opponent is giving me a great effect and I have a lot of things in which that may work. I may try to spend quite a bit and waste a bunch of cubes to take away control from a region, and if not, then get to control the region, at least to tie, to deny control to the opponent, or I can spread somewhere else. And again, it's very important that control, the importance of control of certain regions changes throughout the game. Once a region scores, then it won't be as vital until the end of the game. But if that region score and you haven't built up to that, then the opponent may simply collect a load of points and win the game right there. So you have to worry about Europe. Yes, not all regions are born equal in terms of points. You have to take into account the text, the nature of the effects, because they're really different. They are surprisingly flavorful, thematically speaking, than the way if you do certain things you can move cubes from one region to another, and you can kind of see geopolitical influences taking place there. It has a couple of really interesting elements there, but again, a lot to think about for such a small game where you have 4 cards. Well, the first round you have 5, and so that also choose which one I'm not gonna play, but you're still playing 4. But then for each of those 4, you have to place the cubes. You will get some actions. You are making decisions about the actions of the opponent that is trying to deny possibly all of them, but he won't be able. So you have to select which ones you're trying to deny to the opponent. How you're gonna place your cubes? Again, it's not just a numerical thing. The geopolitical aspect is there in the fact that usually when you're adding cubes by using the command action, you need to have cubes adjacent to it, and sometimes you will create some weird configurations of cards, trying to get new cards as far away as possible from where the opponent has cards, so that it will make it harder for them to go and place cubes there. So there's also that tableau element there. I'm going to block a card so that you cannot control it, you cannot add cubes easily to it. All these kind of things that also give the game that puzzle element. And I like it. So I like it because gameplay is very fast, but it's very highly interactive. It's constantly about what is my opponent going to do. It's constantly about getting majority. You don't need to win by much. You need to win by 1 cube. And that is, again, the quintessence of interaction. Levels of success are only based on the level of the opponent. What you do is based on what the opponent lets you do, and vice versa. So it's incredibly interactive. It's pretty intuitive, it's pretty simple, but really with a couple of interesting angles to it. One thing maybe that I'm a little not certain about is at least the possibility I didn't encounter, but I thought it could happen, the possibility of analysis paralysis, which in a game this small really should not happen. But the second round, the opponent is gonna know all the cards that you have in your hand but 1, if the opponent paid attention, because there is the card that you had during the first round that you put down face down, you saved it for the end of the game. But other than that, the opponent has seen all the cards that they have, of course, all the cards that have been played, and can figure out exactly what you have. If players have become very familiar with the games, with the effects and what the different countries can do, that can be incorporated as part of the meta thing, but of course there is also the problem of like, what if somebody then tries to take that into account. So it's also, because of that, it's also a game where, there are games where experienced players and less experienced players can kind of like still fight it out. Here, if you know the effects, if you know what's coming next, because by exclusion you know what the opponent has and the opponent doesn't know that, then you have a considerable advantage. One of those games in which introducing a new player when you're familiar with the game may be a little harder. Well, not to introduce the player, but to get to a point where the player has any chance of winning against you. Another thing that is a little bit uncertain, a little bit uncertain about, is the final scoring that is done in a specific order. And again, until you learn it, it may feel a little random, like, okay, I controlled a bunch of regions, look at that, overall I'm controlling, yeah, I'm pretty solid for the final scoring. But then the regions that the opponent control score first, and maybe the opponent wins right then. So the order is something that you have to remember and you have to take into account. And again, I'm afraid that the analysis paralysis there may become a factor. To me, it's almost like that's how I played it. The way I played it is like, I'll take the final scoring as sort of like random, a little bit of fate. I won't take it much into account, and I'll simply try to score regions as they come. Because I prefer to have an element of virtual randomness in the final scoring, maybe even losing the game, than to delay the game, than to kill the pace of the game. I prefer to have fun and reduce my chances to win than to be a pain to my opponent and myself, to optimize my chances to win. To enjoy a game, you need to play as if winning was all that mattered, but with a state of mind in which winning is not that important. It's a strange, paradoxical condition, but there is a little bit of mental room in there in which you can walk that line. In general, Iron Curtain, it has that element of final scoring that sometimes may feel a little random, but other than that, it's a very solid design. Really fun, interesting, smart game. I like minimalistic games, and I like this one. It's just a game that can do a lot with the little that it has to work with. In general, a great little game.